modus operandi, which was first honed in the KGB.
Londongrad, as we call the British capital.
Assets of the Russian central bank.
It's much, much larger than any other country has received ever.
The world has to know how a journalist has been tracking the money flow of Putin's people for 7 years, to where, how Ukraine plans to use half of the seized assets of Russia's central bank, how to stop Putin's modus operandi or what, and the bloody KGB cash flow from Moscow to Londongrad and back. KSC analysis and Catherine Belton bestseller-book and the new issue of Forbes Ukraine. European journalists call the British capital Londongrad due to a lot of Russian money hidden there.
Today, there's so much Russian cash in Britain, the capital has been nicknamed Londongrad.
All of this bloody cash of Putin's clique must be seized for the recovery of Ukraine.
British intelligence has warned that oligarchs' money is propping up Putin's regime and helping to fund the war in Ukraine.
Western sanctions to freeze $300 billion, or nearly half of the Central Bank of Russia's hard currency reserves, left Moscow reeling. Co-author of the article "Cracks Emerge in Russian Elite as Tycoons Start to Bemoan Invasion," Catherine Belton wrote in the Washington Post, citing Bloomberg News.
Putin, in taking control of the Russian economy that had already made the transition to the market, essentially had hundreds of billions of dollars at his command and the ability to cause much more chaos.
From 2007, a British financial journalist, Catherine Belton, was working for the Moscow Times and Business Week. In 2013, she became the Moscow correspondent and 2 years later, the legal correspondent for the Financial Times.
Catherine Belton, whose work I started following a long time ago in the Financial Times.
During the next 7 years, she worked with a team of colleagues numbering in the hundreds around the world to investigate Putin's oligarchs and their companies, to track and analyze their banking operations. By 2020, Belton has finished writing her book, Putin's People: How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West.
And what always struck me about Catherine's work then, but came to fruition in an exceptional fashion in her book, Putin's People.
In the last 2 years since the publication of her book, Catherine Belton has withstood unprecedented pressure from Putin's clique, particularly because the data investigated by her journalistic team became the basis for freezing the assets of Russia's central bank after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
I think it's very important to understand under what pressure Catherine stood in the last 2 years.
The work of Catherine Belton struck me. It was March, and we were all shocked and in shock and awe, I would say, about what is happening to Europe, what is happening in the Ukraine.
As a result of Russian military aggression, thousands of civilians died. Multiple cities were shelled by rockets, bombs and artillery, and critical infrastructure facilities, industrial enterprises, thousands of kilometers of roads and thousands of rural estates were destroyed or damaged.
Damage from war and recovery from wartime damage. To a first approximation, Russia will pay for that.
Since February 2022, the beginning of the war, KSE Institute has conducted Russia Will Pay, the project of collecting, evaluating, analyzing and documenting information on direct losses to civilian infrastructure in connection with Russian aggression.
There are hundreds of billions of dollars that have been seized by the US and other countries, assets of the Russian central bank, also assets of Russian oligarchs and so forth. Those are somewhat smaller in magnitude, but that these assets should be available to pay for the recovery.
The Russia Will Pay initiative, in cooperation with the government agencies, collects information on material damage caused by the war. The Ukrainian government needs these data to assess the damages suffered by the state and citizens of Ukraine as a result of Russian aggression and to file claims against Russia in international courts for compensation for these damages. The calculations of Russia will pay project are based on the analysis of several thousands of public notifications from Ukrainian citizens, the government and local authorities about losses and damages throughout the country, as well as on the basis of public sources. The analysis of the caused losses is published on a website, damaged.in.ua.
Recovery and reconstruction. Often, this means the amount of money from outside sources that comes into a country to rebuild that country.
As of June 2023, the total amount of direct documented damage to Ukraine's infrastructure caused by Russia's full-scale invasion is estimated at $150.5 billion. The largest share is the loss of housing stock, $55.9 billion, including about $1 billion in damage from flooding and destruction of residential buildings as a result of undermining of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station in June 2023.
Foreign aid, just from the US alone, that has come to Ukraine, that was in 2022. You can see that it's much, much larger than any other country has received ever.
You in America can't think of yourself as not a democracy because it's part of your national culture. And he's like, that's not true in Russia.
As of June 2023, the total number of residential objects destroyed or damaged as a result of the hostilities is about 167,200 buildings, and another 350,000 are dormitories.
Mariupol, by some estimates today, has a population of roughly 100,000 people versus close to 400,000 before the full-scale invasion.
The housing stock of such cities as Mariupol, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Severodonetsk, Rubizhne, Bakhmut, Mariinka, Lysychansk, Popasna, Izum and Volnovakha suffered the most damage. For example, 90% of the housing stock in Severodonetsk was damaged, while cities such as Bakhmut and Mariinka have almost no intact buildings.
Russia's war on Ukraine is substantially a war on Ukraine's cities. So there's obviously, first of all, the physical damage to residential and non-residential real estate, into infrastructure.
Infrastructure, transportation, road, rail, as well as the aviation and port industries is the second most damaged sector at $36.6 billion. Since the beginning of hostilities in Ukraine, 19 airports and civilian airfields have been damaged, as well as at least 126 railway stations.
And so you think about then what happens to a business that has had collateral that's been damaged over the course of a war.
Damage to business assets is estimated at $11.4 billion. At least 426 large and medium-sized private and state enterprises have been damaged or destroyed since the beginning of the war. Education also remains one of the hardest hit sectors, with direct documented damages from the destruction of educational facilities amounting to $9.7 billion. In total, nearly 3,400 educational facilities were damaged as a result of the hostilities. The direct damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure is estimated at $8.8 billion. Another $8.7 billion is a direct loss to the agricultural industry due to the war. Total losses from the destruction and damage to social, scientific, health, cultural, sports and administrative facilities amount to about $5.9 billion.
Yeah, I remember I was doing like a master at Ditela before the PhD.
Sebastian Galeani, professor of the economics at the University of Maryland, said policymakers face the difficult task of containing inflation and supporting economic recovery. The need for a global safety net and regional arrangements to buffer economies from shocks become ever more critical as we navigate this shock-prone world. The war in Ukraine underscores the importance of international cooperation and collective strength in dealing with the challenges that lie ahead, he told Forbes Ukraine.
The most important questions in history were related to economics.
In the latest post-Independence Day issue, Forbes Ukraine analyzed the main world economic consequences of the war in Ukraine and how the Russian aggression affected every country and created 3 long-term trends for the world economy, leading to slowing growth and faster inflation. Firstly, Russia and Ukraine, both major commodities producers, have experienced significant disruptions due to the conflict. Global prices for commodities like oil, natural gas and wheat have surged, with wheat alone accounting for 30% of global exports from these 2 countries. Food costs have reached record highs. Secondly, neighboring economies are grappling with disrupted trade, supply chains and unprecedented surge in flows of refugees. Resulting from the pandemic, European economies, heavily reliant on the Russian natural gas imports, are experiencing rising inflation and slowing economic recovery. Governments may face additional fiscal pressure as they invest in energy security and defense budgets. And thirdly, the geopolitical tension triggered by the war has led to reduced business confidence and high investor uncertainty.
With this amount of aid comes opportunities but also challenges.
Geopolitical tensions raise the risks of economic fragmentation, particularly in trade and technology. Europe and neighboring regions will be at the epicenter of these changes, as Russia's recession and ongoing sanctions reshape their financial landscape.
The sanctions can work. They don't always work, but nothing always works. If it's done the right way, these are some of the ingredients that are needed.
The world has to know that it must fight not the consequences but the causes of the Russian aggression, particularly Putin's modus operandi, first honed in the KGB, in which billions of dollars were funneled to corrupt officials and weaken the political strength of the Western alliance.
Now, the UK is under pressure to show its Western allies it can stop the flood of corrupt money. Dominic Grieve is a former Conservative Member of Parliament who served as Attorney General and chaired Britain's Intelligence Committee.
Money has been flowing into the United Kingdom, absolutely no doubt about this, which often has had what I could only describe as a tainted source. But then Russia is a mafia state.
The more Russian cash, often some of it untraceable, the more opportunity there was to deploy it to buy off and corrupt officials here.
To fight these and to prevent global economic's long-term problems, the toughest possible sanctions must be imposed against all the bloody cash flows of the KGB.
There is this nickname for Eaton Square, it's called Red Square, because there's so many Russians. I mean, it's a slightly ironic nickname because obviously Red Square is, tends to be associated with communism. Someone who has stolen a company in Russia, you are only rich because you're friends with Vladimir Putin.
The entire assets of $600 billion of the Central Bank of Russia must be frozen and transferred to the EU to be used for the rebuilding of Ukraine.
Trust this Prime Minister to clean up dirty Russian money in the UK when he won't even clean up his own political party.
Mr. Speaker, I just think it's very important for the House to understand we do not raise money from Russian oligarchs, people who give money to this. We raise money from people who are registered to vote on the UK Register of Interest, and that is how we do it.
Now is the time to sanction every oligarch and crack open every shell company so we can prove Putin wrong.
I went to Joe Biden and talked about this. We're giving this message, and the Biden administration saying, well, don't do too hard. We don't want to do too much damage. The average Russian is not our enemy. These are the wrong messages. It was wrong, and we got it corrected.
This is exactly what the world has to know.